largely comes from the fact that, as we all know, that from 1991, the state in Somalia, to some extent, collapsed. And we, as a result of that, we started to see a large exodus of people leaving the country. My study in particular focuses on men that are living in South Africa, but continue to have families in countries like Somalia or other parts of East Africa. The significance, or rather the importance of doing this, is that fatherhood is often understood, or father involvement is often understood through a lens of physical presence. But in this situation, we have men that have separated from their families for periods of close to 10 to 20 years, but still consider themselves and still maintain relationships with their children, with their wives, even though they've never managed to see each other physically for the past 20 to 10 years. So the study, okay, let me just do this. So the study is informed by 3 research questions. However, for today, I'll focus on one. How do Somali transnational fathers navigate the complexities, difficulties, contradictions that define their understandings of fatherhood and practice, and fatherhood and their related practices? Just for the sake of time, I'm just going to go to my initial findings, because this is part of a PhD project, but the data collection process has not yet been completed. So far, I've done 7 interviews and I've conducted 1 object facilitation focus group. And to do the data analysis, I used Adele Clark's situation analysis. And I've done the situational maps, the social world maps, and positional maps. So far, what I've found from the data, and I do say that it's initial because one has to continuously familiarize themselves with the data, is that we've noticed that the long periods of separation, somehow these are something that these men identify as challenges, is that the long periods of separation from their families and their children have started to challenge the notion of fatherhood involvement as based on physical presence. And another thing that they encounter is that they thought that by leaving Somalia and coming to South Africa, they'd actually have a way much more better life. Their well-being would actually improve, but they found out that living in South Africa, they often live in sort of like prison, in prison environments, in the sense that South Africa does not have a family reunification program for refugees. And as you know, as a refugee, then you are merely limited to South Africa. And largely because South Africa does not have refugee camps, it has self-settlement projects where people could live within the communities. So these groups of men have started to create businesses, but these businesses themselves have attracted frustrations from community members that do not have jobs, but also because most of them are not documented properly, they do not have access to banks. So they end up sleeping with large amounts of money within the shops, which results in them being targeted by community criminals. So these men also have to deal with this notion of uncertainty and loss. What we found out, or rather what I found out, is that they always have to constantly deal with the fact that they do not know, whenever they try to call their families, whether these family members would still be alive because they cannot meet with them. But there's also the loss of status. Some of the men that I had interviewed were people that had PhDs. Some of them were people that were nomads and had their lands taken away from them, their cattle taken away from them, and they have not really managed to find themselves or process the losses that they actually got to go through within their own countries. Then there's also the element of the difficulties of parenting by proxy. Because these men are often not in those countries, they have to deal with the fact that they parent through extended family networks. But they show that these creates problems in the sense that because they can never really send enough money back home, it means that the families sometimes separate the children so that they do not become a burden. So a father could phone a child and Next month, when they call their children, they find that the child has been moved to another part of the country. And it takes close to 3 months or close to 6 months sometimes to be able to find that child. And they also live with this challenge of this longing to reunite with their children, but there's this fear of going back to the country because they believe that men are often the first targets of the fighting groups in Somalia. So even in as much as they want to be with their families, even if they want to be with their children, but they encounter this fear of knowing that if they go back, they're much more likely to die. Thank you very much. I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you. I really was excited about this presentation when I saw the application because it reminded me of work by Nicholas Townsend. I don't know if you're familiar. Nick Townsend wrote in the early 1990s, he's an anthropological demographer working in South Africa who made very similar observations about fatherhood. And so I want to bring those into the conversation. Basically, you start here at the premise that fatherhood is based on physical presence. But of course, fatherhood is based on any number of different things based on cultural context. And in many contexts, in Nick Townsend's observations for South Africa, fatherhood was based on being an economic provider. And in fact, being physically present in the household, in an economy that depends on migrant labor, meant that you were probably not providing. So it was the bad father that was at home in this case. And it was the unloved child who might be exposed to his father's physical presence based on this very particular economically and socially structured reality. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the starting point notions of fatherhood and how physical presence fits within, a whole constellation of other values or responsibilities that these fathers see as a part of parenting.
Well, the basis of physical presence is that let me do this. This is something that I did not discuss. What these men were telling me is that often manhood is often understood as provision. You are the breadwinner. You have to provide economically for your family. But they were showing me that in their situation, because they often oversee the education of their children, seeing that the children go to the madrasa, seeing that the children are also involved in their secular education. There's also a need to teach children about culture to ensure that the child knows the knowledge, to ensure that the children know how to rear cattle in those kinds of situations. And there's also this notion of that the father is supposed to be able to care, to discipline for their children. So what they were basically telling me was that in as much as their absence from their families has sort of limited the extent to which they could do or perform those duties. And I know that in the South African context, usually fatherhood is often understood through the lens of economic provision of fatherhood absence. And that is largely informed by the fact that a whole lot of men in South Africa used to work quite far away from their families. And that is why that is something that became acceptable. People used to work in mines. People used to work in factories and their families were in the rural areas. But you then get to realize, especially if you compare with the experiences of Somali men, that the conceptualizations of fatherhood in South Africa may have also lost other aspects that are now taken for granted. And these men, who are Somali men, they try, and in fact, unfortunately, I didn't even also discuss that, is that they also try to sort of play these roles that they feel that are also important by communicating with their families through digital phones. For example, you could call your family and read through into the work with your child. If you send money home, you are able to say to them, can I please see that you guys have bought those things? So the digital technology has sort of allowed them to be able to play the roles that they've wanted to, but not in a manner that physical presence allows them to. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, thank you. More questions and comments?
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I recognize that right now your sample is pretty small, but what have you seen in terms of fathers who talk about going back to Somalia or bringing their families to South Africa? Are either of those options that they hope for, and kind of which one do you hear more?
Well, thank you for saying that the sample is too small. As I'd also said that the data collection is not complete.
Yes.
But the fathers cannot bring their families to South Africa, largely because South Africa doesn't have a family reunification program. So it means that if you come to South Africa to look for asylum, at that time when you do not have your family members with you, chances of them coming and reuniting with you in the country are very little, unless they would be smuggled into the country, and then they would also have to go through the process of applying for asylum. The prospect of them also going to Somali, they do not see them happening because of the conflict that continues in the country. They point out that men often run away, largely because they're often targets for forced recruitment into the fighting groups. So as a result of not wanting to be part of that group, part of the fighting, they therefore see it best that to leave, escape away from the country. But they often come to the country, South Africa, hoping that they'd be able to reconnect with their families here, but that's not possible. And that is why you find that these men have been separated from their families for so long. Some had hoped that, still have hope that they could come to the USA or Canada. And if they could come to the USA or Canada, they believe that the immigration regime in the USA is way much more fairer than the ones in Africa. That could allow them to reunite with their families in the USA or Canada.
I was wondering if the men speak about, you mentioned a little bit about the difficulties of sometimes the burden on their families that they left behind is big, their extended families or the networks. And so children have to move around. So that suggests that maybe there can be tensions around the support that they're providing for their children, say to their relatives, and that's not really my question. My question is just to think about what do they say about the relations, what are the difficulties of the relations that they have where they're sending their things, where their children are staying. Are their children staying with relatives primarily, relatives of theirs, relatives of the mother? And how does that complicate what they are doing? So if it's the kind of paternal relatives versus maternal relatives, or just what are some of the challenges they face, and are they concerned about those challenges?
Oh, yes. They're definitely concerned about those challenges. Well, the parenting by proxy happens in two ways. Either usually these men often get divorced. Sometimes they get divorced from their wives. And once there's a divorce that has taken place, communication does not become as constant as possible. And some men, what they would do is that they sort of then use the divorce as a way of detaching themselves from their children, because they get tired of the burdens of not being able to send enough. So they can just say, some will justify, well, I'm not with the mother anymore, well, she can take the responsibility. But then paternally, the children sometimes do stay with the relatives of the fathers. And the kinds of problems that they encounter is that, yes, there's tensions because sometimes they can never send enough for the relatives so that they can provide for their children's food. So creating burdens within the family. But the one thing that seemed to worry most of these men that I spoke about was, as a result of them not being there, their relatives were not taking the educational responsibilities of their children quite seriously. As a result, the children had started to, some children were now living in the streets. Some were now addicted to drugs. There's also fear that the children will end up being recruited into the fighting groups. But they were saying that due to this fear that these children are not getting education. So there's also this fear that even if there were to be stability tomorrow in the country, these children are likely to be part of a lost generation, in the sense that they are not going to have the skills that are necessary. And because their families have lost their lands, it is also going to be very difficult for them to say that they're going to continue with the nomadic lifestyle.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question to that. Sorry, Ernestina, did you want to say something? Okay. The concern about children of these men doing drugs or getting into other trouble, can you talk about evidence for that being a real pattern versus that narrative as more of like a social panic or, you know, a fear or projection of what this crisis looks like or feels like? It sounds very much like the kind of thing we often hear when there's a social crisis going on, but that's quite different as a researcher to understand the impact of these behaviors versus the way people talk about them or articulate their fears.
Well, thanks for asking that question. Well, in terms of having the evidence, because I was merely focusing on the experiences or narratives of these men, I do not have them. But the men that I spoke about, there was a fear that the children would go to the streets. There was a fear that the children would end up being recruited into the fighting groups. But what they have told me, as what they have experienced, is that some of their children were no longer attending school. The children weren't attending school. So that's the one thing that was then therefore creating this fear that this may happen to the children. This may result to the children. That's the main reason.
Thank you.
Yeah. So quick question. You mentioned the ability to be present because of digital technologies like Zoom, like FaceTime, being able to see what the fathers bought with their money. But if they're not able to access banking systems, how are they sending remittances back to Somalia, back to other parts of East Africa? Are they using M-Pesa? Are they using intermediaries? How does that system work?
Well, there are two systems. There's Hawala system, which is the informal system that Somalis often have to send money. But they do point out that the system tends to have problems. But because there are Somalis in the community that have papers, that have bank accounts, people have started businesses out of that. They would open different bank accounts and then rent out the accounts to different kinds of people. So I would go open different bank accounts with several banks. So then what you would do is then is that if you want to send money, you would come to me. I take a certain portion of the money that you have and then send it. Then we'd have to find someone to do the same thing on the other side with.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's fascinating.
I have a question. Do you have any evidence or any premonitions about the concept of fatherhood changing for the Somali men who are there because of being away and being in a different context?
Well, that's the question that I did not talk about. There is some evidence, but it still needs to be followed upon. That is why there's also data that still needs to be collected. But the one change that had emerged was that some fathers were starting to see education as a very important responsibility of a father, more particularly secular education, which is something that they said that initially, yes, they knew it was important, but they did not consider it as that important. But being in South Africa forced them to sort of see it as important. And the reason why that's the case is that they had mentioned to me that most of them, when they lived they usually used to be nomadic people. So they only even started reading when they got to South Africa. They learned how to read when they got to South Africa. A whole lot of other things related to the need for you to get education, to get a job. These are things that they started to see as important as a result of the suffering that they're encountering in South Africa. So at the current moment, that's the only thing that's there. But there still needs to be more research in terms of how then them being in South Africa for so long has changed how they see their fatherhood.
Can you say more about those changes amongst the men? I'm particularly interested in situating their ideals of fatherhood within other ideals of masculinity. So maybe how those networks support, you know, being a good man, being a good friend, being a good Somali, other the kind of broader context for what these changes in fatherhood look like.
Can you come again? What's the question?
How do these ideals of fatherhood fit with other ideals of masculinity for these men in South Africa?
Or how do they relate with the ideals of masculinity in South Africa?
Yes.
Well, one thing that happens is that because when I often ask these men this question, and it's one of those things where you see people contradicting themselves. Most of them were saying that they don't see having lived in South Africa having had any impact in how they perceive themselves, either as men or as fathers. And this is something that you see across most of them. But what then happens is that one of the reasons that may be the case is that maybe it's the place where they live, because the area in which they live is called Mayfair, and that's an area that's largely dominated by Somalis. And as a result of that, they largely interact amongst the Somali community without much interaction with the Black South African community that much. So I'm not saying that's the reason, but this is me just making an inference that I may still need to prove.
I'm also curious if you hear about reasons that they came to South Africa versus, say, Kenya. I know has a large Somali diaspora and would be easier to get to, I would think. What are some reasons people go all the way to South Africa?
Well, for some people, there are two main reasons. The one reason was that they could, through South Africa, the UNHCR, through South Africa, could be able to still move on to the USA or somewhere in Europe. But the other influence for people to come to South Africa is the what in South Africa tends to be called the refugee economies, which means that a lot of Somalis tend to have businesses in the townships, although they don't live there. So the reason why a lot of migrants are coming to South Africa is largely that they say that in South Africa there's a lot of liquid cash. People can buy a lot from their businesses, which is something that is not there where they live in refugee camps. And the reason why they also come to South Africa is that in South Africa, people are not confined to refugee camps. They are able to, there's a system of self-settlement. People can live anywhere where they want to live if they can afford to pay the rent, that is.
So as a follow-up to that question, I wonder if you have considered, or whether it's possible to interview or talk to some people who also migrated, but are not resident in South Africa. I know it will be very difficult. That's maybe not the question, but the reason I'm asking that is because some of your conclusions about physical presence, it may be that the people who are least concerned about that and more concerned about material provision are the ones who are more likely to go far, like South Africa, as opposed to the ones who are more concerned about physical presence, may be likely to need more to take them away from being close with their families. So it may be that the conclusion is part of the reason why the people are in South Africa in the first place.
Possible.
All right, that's time. Thank you so much, Bongani, for the presentation. And good luck with the next phases of the project.
Thanks.
We're going to transition next to Christabel Tsoto, who's here from the KU Department of Geography. Fantastic. Christabel, you have 10 minutes.
All right, hi everybody, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
All right, cool. So share screen, just give me a second. Right. All right, so as been said, my name is Christabel from Geography, and I'm doing a comparative study of well-being outcomes for children of regionally and internationally migrated parents. So a bit of the background. This is part of my bigger research for my PhD, and my bigger research is on the effects of parental migration on the well-being of children who have been left behind in Zimbabwe. And so I've just recently finished coding my interviews, and I've started also doing my my qualitative, my survey data. I'm also just cleaning up my data and creating variables and stuff like that. So as I was going through some of my data, I discovered I had not initially, this had not been an objective of my research, but this became something that was an unexpected discovery, and I found that children with parents who had migrated regionally tended to have worse outcomes than children with parents who had migrated further abroad. So in this case, for the purposes of this paper, regionally, I'm using to refer to the SADC region. So these are Zimbabwe's neighboring countries. And then internationally, I'm using the term to refer to further abroad beyond the boundaries of the SADC region. So just a brief review on how people make the decision on where to migrate to. Zelensky he proposes a hump-shaped relationship between economic growth and immigration. People tend to think that, the general assumption is that poor people, when people are looking at migrants, they're looking at migrants as people who are poor, people who are uneducated and stuff like that. But Zelensky proposes that he thinks that as development increases in a country, immigration tends to rise, and then it reaches a peak and in middle income countries. And there are several other studies that have supported his finding. But then there are also others that have, like Ortega and Perry, who have also kind of disagreed with him. So I just want to briefly unpack the hypothesis in terms of understanding where people choose to migrate to. So the first one is the inclination and opportunity to migrate. So the resources that are available to potential migrants, right? They also help them to decide on where to migrate to. So for example, if somebody has enough resources or capacity to migrate further abroad, they're going to consider that, as opposed to somebody who has got less resources. They're just going to think in terms of how close they can migrate to. And then also immigration policies of destination countries, that's also, that's an opportunity to immigrate. It's easier to migrate within the SADC region for a lot of Zimbabweans than internationally, because the visa requirements for other countries, like especially the US, Canada, Australia, they can be very restrictive. They can be very expensive. So, and the requirements that they might need to meet, that may be a lot. So there's also the impact of economic development on the desire to emigrate. So for example, how a country is developing you know, the economic development of a country. But in this case, this kind of puts Zimbabwe in a not typical situation to his hypothesis, because Zimbabwe is in, for lack of a better word, I'll just call it an economic meltdown. So this is, of course, resulting in a lot of people seeking opportunities elsewhere. And then the household level, the household income level also plays a big role in people deciding where to go. So Langela and Manning, they found that household income is important when determining where to immigrate to. So the more money a household has, the more disposable income a household has, the more they're likely to migrate further abroad, you know, than within the region, because they have the funds, they have the money to do so. And also this might also be tied in with the skills of a person. So you find more skilled people might migrate further abroad than just within the region. So like I said, it's stereotypical that migrants are viewed as illiterate and poor, and this is not often true, because long distance journeys require some skills or some financial resources. And while migrants from low income countries aim to reach more affluent areas of the world, a bigger percentage of people migrate to neighboring low income countries in the same geographical area. So for example, according to the IOM 2024, there were 21 million Africans living in another African country, compared to 19.5 million Africans living in other non-African regions. So for my research, I did, it was a mixed method. So I had a survey which I administered a questionnaire to 300 students aged 13 to 18 years. And in Zimbabwean education system, this is like from Form 1 to Form 6. And I just used the basic stratified multi-sampling strategies with 6 schools from the 6 districts in Harare. So I just got a school from each of the 6 districts. So this is just basic statistics that are relevant to this paper. So you can just see the distribution. So this is 300 and out of 301, you know, and we had about 215 from my sample who had parents who were migrants. So this is just the general distribution of where the parents went to, where they had migrated to. And you see that a bigger portion of the sample, 165, 77% of the sample migrated regionally, and then 16% migrated internationally. And then I had 23 interviews with 23 caregivers, and I just used the snowball sampling method because it was easier than the other ways that I tried. And so from the caregiver interviews, we have 52% of the household surveyed that had people who had migrated within the region, and then 48% internationally. So my basic finding from this is that our children from households whose parents migrated regionally were more likely to have negative financial outcomes than children with parents who migrated internationally. And we find that financial status of the household affects several well-being outcomes like access to education, access to health, access to nutritious food, and access to communication even. And so I've just, like I said, I've just started doing the analysis. So I just, for the time being, I was just focusing on the financial outcomes. And some of the quotes from the interviews that I found interesting, that I kind of support this. Like, for example, you have Gambisa, who says that in response to the question on whether her daughter-in-law, who had left a child with her, sent anything, she was like, yeah, the mother calls, but she doesn't send anything. And this woman has been taking care of her daughter-in-law or of a grandchild for over 10 years. But since the mother left for South Africa, she hasn't been able to send something. And this you find is because she's in informal employment in South Africa. Please let me know when how I'm doing on time. And then you have, sorry?
Your time is approaching.
Okay, all right. So yeah, so these are I just took a couple of quotes from interviews just to show the financial to give a brief picture of the financial situation for those who migrate within the region. So you also have Ngwe, whose daughter sends like $20 once in a while, and she's also in informal employment in South Africa. And then you have, on the flip side, you have got people who have got, like Chireso's husband was based in the Congo or in Gabon, and he was able to send money regularly and a lot of it. And then you also have an example of Duve's husband who was working in Sudan, and she says they were 100% financially stable and they had no issues there. And then Mamoyo also has reported that his sister moved to Australia. She's a teacher, and there was significant improvement in the finances as opposed to before she left. So just based on this, just based on these and the other interviews, that was just my finding. So I am doing a deeper dive into this, and I think one of the reasons that explains this is that it's the skilled, because like I said, because they have access to resources, the more skilled, they tend to migrate further abroad because there are bigger and better opportunities, while the less skilled or the non-skilled people would migrate within the region because it's easy, for example, just we call it border jumping in Zimbabwe. So, which is like crossing the border without the proper papers. So then they just border jump into South Africa, and they're able to do the 3D jobs, dangerous, dirty, and oh dear, sorry, I forgot the 3Ds. And so those are the jobs that they're then able to do because they're kind of paid under the table and people take advantage of them. So you find that then their income is not as much. So then they're now supporting a household in South Africa or in Botswana or in Namibia or in Mozambique where they're living, and while at the same time they are trying to also take care or send money home. So it becomes a bit challenging for them. So yeah, basically this is just my initial findings.
Thank you. Well, we'll transition into the conversation part. I think you did a good job in the conclusion there, linking the original literature review, which is really about the choice of destination, to your research question, which was about the impact on children. And I was wondering if you could help bridge that a little bit further. The choice of destination, you gave us the framework of class and resources of who's able to migrate further abroad. Do you be able to identify effects other than the financial ones in looking at children's well-being? I know you're just beginning to work with this analysis, but
yeah,
it seems like you have an economic story right now that wealthier people are able to go farther and they're able to better sustain their households. What more is there that you're looking for in your data?
Okay, so I hope I got you correctly because my network was kind of breaking in and out. So you are, let me rephrase this, you're asking if there is anything else besides financial outcomes, right? That I'm finding in the data. Is that it?
Yes, that's exactly it.
All right, yeah. I've also been finding that, like I said, the financial status of a family also in impacts several other outcomes that I'm looking at, like access to education, access to health, access to food, and then psychological well-being of children, right? So but you find that I was also looking at access to communication, for example, because that also affects the emotional relationship between the parents and the children, right? So you have parents who migrate within the region are more likely to return or to visit Zimbabwe than parents who've migrated further abroad. I mean, it costs a lot more to travel from the US back to Zimbabwe than it would to travel from South Africa or from Botswana or from from Mozambique, because it's, if they cannot fly, they can just get on a bus, which is way cheaper, right? So parents within the region are more likely to return more frequently than parents further abroad, which gives the children that they have access to their parents more often than not. So of course that might create, that has different implications on the parent-child bond because of the number of times that they get to interact, but also because of the limited, because mostly, like I said, most of the people who are migrating to regional, to the within the region, these are people who are either less skilled or have got no skills at all. So what it means is that the amount of money that they are making is also less, which might also then hinder their frequency of going back and forth between Zimbabwe and whichever country they are in. So that's something I'm also looking at. I'm also looking at further, I'm going to just disaggregate this by, for example, who the children have been left with, because I also found this interesting that maternal, because of Zimbabwe's cultural conditions, right? People tend to leave their children with their maternal relatives more than they do with paternal relatives, right? And from my survey, majority of the students were left with their maternal relatives. And so just going to disaggregate that and see if there are going to be any differences based on who the children have been left with, maternal relatives versus paternal relatives. Is it a male relative or is it a female relative? Because even those that have been left with the fathers tend to even look for a female relative to come in and help them with the children, because typically and traditionally caregiving is a mother's role. So some fathers, when they're left with their own children, they do not know what to do with them. So they'll look for another female relative to just come in and help them take care of. So yeah, I'm just going to go deeper and disaggregate my findings and then just try to see what comes up.
More questions?
So Kiri, great work as always. Really glad to get your survey done. But I'm just curious, like you're focused in Harare, so that's a very urban center. These people might have more skills, they might have more ability to travel than regions of Zimbabwe. Have you thought about expanding into other schools, other districts? In addition to that, what other measures did your survey account for? You only presented on a few narrow indicators, but what other data measures did you capture in the survey?
All right, so the first question, like initially, I had dreams of doing this, like Zimbabwe has got 10 provinces. I wanted to do this like from 4 provinces, and my initial survey was going to have like 3,000 respondents. But hey, I'm just a lowly PhD student who didn't have a lot of funding. So in order for the purposes of my PhD, I really had to cut down. My supervisor was like, yeah, this is too huge for a PhD project. Unless you've got like a very big grant in the hundreds of thousands, you can't do this. So I had to come down. And one of the reasons that I chose to focus on Harare was there have been some studies, like some other people have done some studies, but people tend to stay away from Harare for the very reason that you've mentioned, like it's the capital city. So everybody's always assuming research is being done in Harare, And so I was like, okay, people seem to be going to all other provinces except Harare. And also for financial reasons, it just became prudent for me to just focus on Harare, because then I would be able to do my data collection without financial strain by going outside the region, the province, the capital city itself. And your second question, sorry, I didn't get that. Can you repeat?
Totally fine. I was just curious what other data measures you collected in your survey. Was it just, do you have a migrant parent? Does your parents have money? Like what other variables did you capture in your survey?
Oh, I collected a lot. My questionnaire had like about 80, had 95 questions, and there are so many variables from there which is actually one of the reasons that I took long to clean up my data, because I was trying to figure out which variables to come up with and stuff like that. So I know I can have like tons of papers that can come from just the survey alone, but limited time as a PhD student, of course, I'm just going to focus on. So there are a lot of variables. There's a lot of things that I was asking, like the type of house they were living in, the how many bedrooms the house has got, how often the parents get in touch, if the person that they are staying with treats them the same as their own children or they're treated differently, what their relationship to the caregiver is, if they think if they think their own perceptions on migration as well, like do they think that it's beneficial that their parents have migrated or not? Would they like to join their parents in the country where they've migrated to, or would they prefer that their parents come back home? So there are a lot of variables that I'm still playing around with, which I think can also be, is kind of like a drawback, because I'm now like having to decide like, oh, this one sounds interesting, but I can't because of the time or because of risk factors. So yeah, there are a lot of other variables that I have. Yeah.
One suggestion, have your literature to get focused primarily on like the choice of migration and didn't get into the literature on parental relationships with children and children's well-being specifically. But Kati Cole has written extensively about this. I'm thinking about her book called The Scattered Family, which describes migrant mothers leaving Ghana often to the US and the relationships they have with their children. And one of her observations in terms of the emotional well-being of those children is that being in an area of concentrated migration actually helps the children kind of normalize their family structure, and that the children don't really feel abandoned or, you know, unloved by their mother who's left them often to do care work in another country, but that are instead like supported by a culture and a community that makes sense of that. So maybe one thing to look for in your data is that the response rate you have seems like there were plenty of migrants around, but I'd be curious to know how those how their feelings about their parents' migration were affected by the concentration or like normalization of migration, especially of mothers, but maybe also of fathers in the region.
Yeah, that's so true. You find that at this point in Zimbabwe's history, migration is kind of normalized because for a lot of people, the economy is so bad. You will probably have every household, if not the immediate household, they'll tell you, oh, I've got an aunt who's migrated, I've got, you know, so every family will have a relation who's migrated in some form. As of 2020, there were over 3 million people, there were over 3 million Zimbabweans living outside of Zimbabwe. And these are documented. Like this, the number 3 million is from documented people, right? People who've got the passports and visas. So they enter South Africa, they enter Namibia, they enter the UK, they are recorded, so they're able. So excluding the number of people who are irregular migrants, you know, who are not documented migrants, the number can be so big. And Zimbabwe is not a small country, but it's just 15 million population. And then you have like over 3 million people migrated. That's like about a fifth of the population, right? So you can see how that plays out. That so for at this point in time, migration has kind of been normalized in Zimbabwe. People are no longer surprised. It's common for people to tell you, oh yeah, for a child to tell you, like, my mom left when I was 2 and I haven't seen her and now I'm 10 or something like that. So yeah.
I think the dynamics of migration by mothers in Ghana and the situation in Zimbabwe may be slightly different in the sense that in Ghanaian mothers will want to travel outside Africa, whereas like you mentioned in your earlier part of the presentation, that Zimbabweans would want to travel mostly outside Zimbabwe and not necessarily very far away from home. So in the case of Ghana, for instance, migration is prestige, and it's even flouting to tell your friends as a kid that your mom is abroad, it's in the US or it's in it's in Canada, because you get the dollars coming, you get some shoes coming, now you look high and then you are happy. So I can understand the context that the chair raised about how children there feel supported and loved, and mostly because there is support for the families and members of the families who are in charge on taking care of these children, which I don't know if the same dynamics can be said about the internal migration in the case of Zimbabwe. I think I followed your work last year when I was in person, and I must commend you for the progress you have made, and especially looking at your own reflection and taking into consideration things that you didn't expect to find, and also trying to take interest in looking at those elements that has come up from your study. I'm really proud of you, and I'm looking forward to your final work.
We have time for
Just a quick response. Just a quick response to that one. You know, you'll actually be surprised. I was looking at the numbers for Ghana as well. That the biggest number of people who have left Ghana actually in Nigeria. And so it's like when I started this, I thought like, yeah, obviously a lot of people are in the UK and stuff like that, only to be shocked. And because when you're reading, when you're hearing in the media, the West makes it sound like everybody's leaving Africa and going to the West, everybody's leaving Asia and going to the West. So in my mind, it was like, yeah, a lot of people are in US, are in the West. But when you then go to United Nations databases, you find that actually more Zimbabweans are in Africa, more Nigerians are in Africa, more Ghanaians are in Africa, which was a very fascinating find for me.
Yes, I'll ask the question. It's a little bit, maybe two questions. So you began with this observation about regional versus international, and I think you were explaining it mostly in terms of the choices that people have available to them. But
Yep.
for some reason, I thought maybe you were going to talk about it as something that happens in those countries after they've made the choices. You didn't, that's okay, but I wonder, to me, that's an interesting distinction. Like, really, the pattern that you're noting is just kind of an artifact of the fact that these people are already doing well. So if they're now doing better, the way you introduced it was to say, oh, the people who are doing better are the ones who are internationally migrating, and they're doing better than the regional ones. In some sense, by talking about it as a function of choice, that's just a function of the fact that the ones who went internationally were already doing better at the beginning. Nothing happened after they migrated that made them do better now. So that's one question, is if you see anything, if you see anything that is happening differently in those different spaces that would allow you to say, oh, going to an international destination versus a regional is resulting in better well-being because of what's going on there, not because of the fact that they were already doing better.
Okay.
Related to that, though, is I heard you respond to people's questions about additional measures, mostly in terms of, or additional analyses, mostly in terms of what I would call maybe independent variables or other kinds of analyses you could do by category or by looking at well-being as a function of this or as a function of that. But I didn't hear you say very much, maybe you did and I missed it, which is quite possible, about other kinds of well-being. And that becomes interesting because one thing you did mention is like, okay, maybe the people who are migrating regionally, they're not able to send as much money, but they're able to visit them, or they're able to participate more in the child's life in other ways, maybe, or it's not so far. So that might create certain kinds of outcomes for well-being that are not necessarily material outcomes. And so you might have a different story, despite the fact that what we're saying is there's this notion of being absent is not a problem, that the materiality of care is really an important thing, so it might not matter. But it's just a suggestion, which I know you're going to do eventually, is to look at different manifestations of well-being beyond the material, and it becomes an opportunity to see whether being closer, that observation that you made is true across all the measures of well-being, where it's concentrated in the material, which would then get at the question of how much of the benefit is not really benefit, it's just a self-selection kind of thing. People who had the resources in the first place went international, because it's less now tied to the material well-being.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll start with the second one. For the purposes of my dissertation, I was using a 6-dimensional index to measure well-being. So looking at health, physical health, education, financial status, access to protection, access to communication, and psychological health, right? So when for this particular paper, when I started, the starting point was the financial status, right? Because then I have to, going by the interviews, financial status is easier to, it was just easier to pick out. Like somebody says, oh yeah, the mother has been gone for 5 years and they haven't been sending money, and so we're struggling. Or the father has been gone for 10 years and they are in Botswana and they've been sending money occasionally or whatever. So that was the easiest to pick out and just see a trend, like, okay, this is what it's showing. But like you're saying, also like access to communication, right? There are also differences because of the spaces and where people are located, right? Some countries are, for example, Mozambique, it might be more difficult for parents to call because of just infrastructure situation. So access to communication, it might be a neighboring country, but access to communication might be limited. Whereas somebody who is in Canada, for example, because of the infrastructure, it's easier for them to call their child every day or every week because internet connection and stuff like that. So yes, I have that in mind. It's just that this was kind of like a point of kind of like a springboard for the bigger part of this. And as to your first question or first contribution, I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think that's also a very interesting angle to look at it. To look at it like on the things that also happen. It's not to just say that they were already doing better, so of course they've got to do better. I think maybe that's the way it came across, but it's not necessarily that. It's just that, you know, somebody who is skilled is more likely to get better opportunities and have more, like a teacher in Zimbabwe already has the ability to be able to move to another country and be a teacher. Like, for example, the lady who moved to Australia as a teacher and she's teaching. And they are more likely to have more in terms of like, they're able to save more than somebody who is unskilled, like say for example, a housemaid who is earning at most, on average, housemaids in Zimbabwe are earning like $50, an equivalent of $50 a month. So for that person to then save for a visa to the UK, which is, or to Australia, which is going to cost quite a bit, like maybe about 300, and then the passport, and then the flight tickets, the cost of the flights and stuff like that, it's going to take them longer to do that. So, but I get what you're saying. So I'm also going to consider that, like what then happens when the people are in those countries. It's not to say skilled people are not going to neighboring countries, but it's just that because this was, I sampled using snowballing method. So I guess it was just kind of like, oh, okay, I've talked to a friend and it's just that my sample mostly has people who are in neighboring countries who are more informally employed than those who have gone further abroad.
All right, thank you so much, Christabel. Well done on the project so far and good luck with that data analysis.
Thank you.
We'll transition now to our third and final speaker for this panel. Ridwan Muhammed is joining us from here at the University of Kansas Department of History. You have 10 minutes.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Muhammed Ridwan, and I am a second-year student of the Department of History, and the topic of our presenting on today is Lessons of Marriage, Neoliberal Modernity, and Family Planning in Yorubaland. While I allow the audience to go through the outline, I'd like to give the rationale behind the start date and the terminal date for this research. The start date is 1952. This is not to say that family planning program or population program did not start before then, but that was like the first national family planning program done by the British colonial government in Nigeria. And 1990 was the first time the National Population Census program, which was initiated in 1988, got the first assessment by the federal government of Nigeria. And it is a tried knowledge that Nigeria is the most populous nation in Africa, and as such, discussions around its development, whether social, cultural, or demographic, is tied to its high budget. To address this problem, the Babangida-led administration in 1988 decided to come up with the 4 is enough policy. This policy meant that families must not have more than 4 kids, and also this program was said to be a tool for women empowerment as of this point. However, this program was met with a high mismatch with the way an average Yoruba family perceive the family organization and the number of kids to be have also. I'm speaking about my research questions. To this end, this paper asks questions such as, how has the phenomenon of population and development changed over time in Yorubaland? How has population and development changes to impact the state-led family planning policies and social cultural views of family and family planning in Yorubaland? And lastly, is in what ways has the mismatch reinvigorated sexual reproductive health challenges in Nigeria? In this research, I argue that the rising demographic and reproductive health challenges in Nigeria, which includes maternal mortality, infant mortality, complications from abortions, caused or largely caused by enduring misalignment between state-led family planning policies and the deeply rooted cultural values of the Nigerian population. And that this misalignment is caused by historical factors such as colonialism and neoliberal modernity. According to the World Health Organization and also the Demographic Health Survey, in 2020 and 2021 respectively, Nigeria has some of the most alarming sexual reproductive health indices or challenges in Africa. This offers a very interesting perspective in the face of a population that has high level of contraceptive apathy, and also in a country where abortion is illegal. And also to think that with all of these reproductive health challenges, you wonder how Nigeria still manages to be one of the most populous country in Africa and one of the most populous in the world. Now, speaking about the literatures and with regards to the debates that I'm engaging with this research, I'd like to say that this research benefits immensely from existing historical and anthropological works, which have written development, population, and family planning into the annals of African history. Some of the questions or conversations which are quite popular in these conversations are that how sovereignty, migration, and colonization affect population and reproductive health. And also the question of should reproductive health or population be seen from an angle of geopolitics or biopolitics. And lastly is about the debate of if population is problematic phenomenon itself, and how biology and state planning intersect to address demographic and reproductive health challenges. Why I acknowledge this existing debate and scholarships, I would like to contend that demography, population, and development among African people within the context of modernity is very important by employing or using gender and socio-cultural perspective as regards birth control, family planning, and fertility. Now, speaking on the colonial modernity and the decentering of, speaking about the pre-colonial family planning dynamics. Although the phrase family planning is a post-colonial construct. However, this is not to say that family planning didn't exist in the pre-colonial Yoruba societies, especially with the way the economy of the pre-colonial Yoruba society is. It's a family-oriented one, whereby children play a very huge role in it. And also it's important to note that this type of family planning was both expansive and also reductive. This would change following their contact with European missionaries and also colonialism within the which started in 1861 in Lagos and also snowballed into the internet by 1900. And with the pictures we can see above, this is quite gendered, and these are different reproductive health technologies or family planning technologies that existed in pre-colonial Yoruba. The ones above, which are the Single Drum and Oko Shangu, are for men. There are several other ones. And the one below, which is the Lugari and Orishoko, are for the women. And also there are several other ones that are meant for the reductive and expansive approach to family planning. And speaking to the colonial modernity and the centering the family in Yorubaland, the British ran colonial Nigeria on a tripartite mechanism of colonial native courts, colonial authorities, and colonial extractive economy. All of this mechanism culminated into high divorce rates, as we can see with the graph on the screen. First nucleated family orientation, as also we can see with the kind of buildings that existed built by the government for different staff and in civil service. And it's sort of the analysis of these buildings shows that it can only take, say, 4 people, that is the wife, the husband, and maximum of 2 kids. And also the colonial economy, extractive economy, which was really dependent not only on the monetization of the economy, and also industrial activities culminated into rural-urban drift. And as such, put a lot of pressure on the existing infrastructures in the urban centers, which was the sowing of the seed of a lot of demographical challenges existing in many urban regions. Now speaking to the crisis of development in post-colonial Nigeria. Several erroneous neoliberal assumptions have been engaged in this by African scholars, and some of the ones that were engaged in this work are that only census-driven tools can address demographic and sexual reproductive health challenges, and also that the ability to control birth is an index for sexual modernity, civilization, and development. Thirdly is that women are the de facto gender that determines reproduction. And lastly is that procreation among African population is not a rational endeavor. All of these erroneous neoliberal assumptions went into the formulation of structural adjustment program of 1986 and subsequent 4 is enough policy of 1988, which was rejected by Nigerians, especially Nigerians of Yoruba origins. Also, to further discuss this crisis of development is that while we can recognize that there were pushback for Nigeria by Nigerians, it's also for us to recommend that, to understand that the federal government also with the NGOs working hand in hand use different tools to propagate these family planning ideas. I mean, by family planning, I mean the neo-colonial family planning ideas, by making family planning as a marker of citizenship, as we can see up there. Most of the flyers distributed in health centers has the Nigerian map, sometimes it has coat of arms, and the ideal family would usually be 1 man, 1 woman, and a maximum of 2 kids. And also the Nigerian music industry and the Nigerian Neoliberal was also used, as you can see in that album choices, the songs on that album was dedicated to family planning. And also the flyer down here has to do with, it's flyer popular used by the Planned Parenthood Federation, which depicted the kid being carried as a marker of a burden rather than an asset, which you can see from the look of the mother and the father. And also the policy of 4 is enough being said to be a tool for women empowerment appear not to be a truism in the sense that in the family dynamic or marital dynamics that exists in Nigeria, whereby polygamy is a thing, it means you can only trace the kids being born by the women rather than kids being born by the men. It means the men could give birth to more, whereby the women, regardless of their situation, give birth to just 4. And also one thing I would like to point out here is that while all of this was going on, okay, our time is almost up.
Your time is up.
I think I'm just going to wrap up. So with this study, with this work, I'm concluding that the disconnect in the narrative of falling enough and also reproductive health challenges, including maternal health, infant health, and complications from abortion, is caused by imposition of external ideologies rooted in colonial neoliberal perspective, has failed and to address the reproductive health needs to the population, and particularly in the context of Yoruba families who emphasizes on extended and large families. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited about this project, and I'm curious about how you're framing it. It seems like what you presented is an enormous history that involves so many different pieces, that you have family planning as related to a monogamous marriage. I think I saw the word nucleated, so like a single household rather than a compound household. You've got women's empowerment mixed in. You've got a changing economy and urbanization. Is the goal of the project to be comprehensive in all of that, or what are the kind of like are there specific threads that you're more interested in tracing through with the neoliberal
So the
framework?
specific thread, I'm just using all of those to narrate how neoliberal family planning ideals is affecting the Nigerian population, and we can see it in the rising rates of reproductive health challenges. So, for instance, I talked about the assumptions which have gone into this policy. So what I'm trying to say here is, for instance, we say Nigeria is the most populous nation on earth, and when governments wants to operate on that, when non-governmental organizations want to operate on that, they focus on reducing the population. And as such, we ignore the fact that infertility is a problem. In a country whereby having kids, it's important, not necessarily for economic reasons, but psychological reasons also. So infertility treatment, for instance, has been put out of the pockets of an average Nigerian women, even Nigerian men. So I'm really using this project to talk to the overtime operation of colonialism and neoliberal, modernity, which is being engineered by this non-governmental organization over time, to say that let's start looking at family planning the way it was, maybe not 100% the way it was in pre-colonial, because the central thing of the pre-colonial family planning thing is it is done along familial needs. If you think you are a farmer, you need more hands in your farm, you want to give them more, there is access for you. If you think you are in another profession which doesn't require you have so much, and your facility so high, it can be reduced. So let's have both reductive and expansive system of family planning, not just you are marrying on reduce it. So that's the trust of this.
So I guess my follow-up is then what's the, I think you've made the point very well that these aren't responding to, sort of indigenous needs or desires, but are rather being imposed in this neoliberal structure. So my question is, like, what is the mechanism or reason behind that? Do you think that these NGOs are just responding to global funding opportunities? Do you think this is a matter of elites trying to modernize a country to their, enhance their own prestige within a changing Nigeria? Like, what is the kind of force or momentum behind these neoliberal ideas that's made them so, I don't want to say popular, but it has given them so much power in this country?
So the way I see it is, firstly, you talked about the funding opportunities, and typically when NGO operates, they operate like a parasite. Sometimes they come and just, operationalize the ideals of their funding nation. For instance, Mary Stopes, which is like the NGO organization attached to the British organization. Whatever they do, the funding comes from them, whatever they do has to do with what are the ideals of the British Parliament on family planning, and that's what they do. So they are being influenced by that, they are being influenced by the funding opportunities that they got, and there are some aspects that they themselves are not looking at. For instance, this book right here, The Other Population Crisis, What Government Can Do, about family planning birth rate. Most European countries clamoring against high population are suffering from failing birth rate right now. And how about we take that into consideration in relation to the high population to design a policy that is best for everyone? So that is where I'm coming from with how this NGO operates. And speaking about funding, one of the rationale that engineered this research was when I was working on with I'm trying to remember this popular NGO in the US. They have this archive in Nigeria, and I found out that the more money being spent on reproductive health challenges, the more the indices of unfortunate statistics goes up. Just like you don't look like the money is just going down the drain. So what could be responsible for it? So these are some of the things that I'm putting in mind while I'm trying to research this question.
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'm not sure if I get you correctly. I think you talked about colonialism and how the colonial structure kind of, did it cause like the population to balloon? Is that what you're trying to say?
Okay, so it's historically grounded, but I couldn't go into all of that while I was presenting. The British colonial government, when they took charge of Nigeria, preached population increase. As a matter of fact, they said the pre-colonial Nigerian situation represents demographic stagnation, and that having more population is synonymous with progress. Now, after taking charge, we understand why they did that. They needed more people to pay tax and all of several other economical reasons for that. But while that was going on, they have this policy against abortion. So how do you, so our policy against abortion. So it was the same for British colonial government that had all of that. And it's telling us now that we should legalize abortion. What has changed over time? These are the things I'm considering. And also the fact that the colonial economy that existed meant that people would leave the monetized economy, that people would leave the rural area for the urban spaces to participate in this monetized economy. And the colonial government have not invested enough. We have seen in several documents where they say their own colonies have to be self-sustaining. So if it's not self-sustaining, it's not their problem. So people have moved from the rural area to the urban spaces. It means there will be pressure on the existing infrastructures. And that's where demographic challenges starts. And that's like the root of the demographic challenges. So these are some of the things we have to put in mind.
Okay, thank you.
And also the native court was part of how they run it. The native court, what native court did was it brought another sense of justice to address familial African concerns. The way we run family back home in Africa is different from the way they run their own. But they bring this sense of justice that said it has given rights to children, rights to women, just like the policy has done, but in real time, it's not. The right that has been given to children meant that we, colonial Nigeria witnessed high level of, what do we call this, kids that are not behaving in proportion to delinquency. Thank you. We have a high level of delinquency, and they were taken to these yards, which means they could use them for labor as punishment. So all of these are very systematic, and you have to be deeply rooted in this history to understand how it is.
Yeah, well then I think I'm interested in semantic analysis part of your pictures. Trying to use the survey plan of the house, which is contrary to the African setting, so to say. And I don't even know where, if it's part of your scope to try to look at oral history of the population and fertility. I'm aware that in the traditional practice or medical practice in Yorubaland, I knew that our forefathers years back, they tried to use some terms not to, for instance, not to have, not to impregnate a lady, for instance. I know that's also another style of trying to limit their the number of children who want to give birth. I don't know if that is part of the scope of
it's part of it, because the way the technologies are displayed work is not medicalized. Those ones that I displayed, and there are lots of other ones that are behavioral. There are lots of other ones that are actually with herbs and plants. So all of those are in the larger work that I'm working with.
In the historical record, like, do you see the combination of these different technologies being presented? I mean, part of the 4 is Enough plan is a kind of like moral message about like what makes a good family.
Yeah.
And it's kind of independent of the technologies then required to execute family planning, right? So do you see like overlap or kind of reappropriation of pre-colonial and indigenous fertility, family messaging in any of this period?
So I've not delved into that, but one thing I know for sure is what we call biomedicine with regards to reproductive health or family planning is not always biomedicine 100%, because the development of biomedicine is itself is like an amalgamated knowledge from their contact with Africa, with Asia, which has been, revolutionized into what they have done. So I can't say for sure that it has not been appropriated into it in history, but I know I think I read the work by Dr. Mavundla, which is what is science and technology to Africa, and you'll be surprised how many what we call revolutionary science or medicine technologies that emanated from Africa, but then due to the Industrial Revolution that's been taken into the higher spaces. And it's one of the reasons African historians push back against the word using say Western medicine. No, and it's not totally Western medicine because a lot of things have been appropriated into that thing. So that's why we often call it biomedicine now. So I can't be so sure that they are not.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting observation because like the concept of population itself is a construct, right? Like there's a history of that idea and an invention and then like the technology of governance that comes around it, like from Foucault and everybody else. And so thinking about family planning in an indigenous way has a lot of similarities, but is independent of this idea of a population that ought to be sized for productivity in the land or whatever. Like it has its own kind of logic or reasoning within it. And so I'm curious, or I find it really interesting to compare.
In Yoruba pre-colonial societies, more population is synonymous to progress. And as such, the way the society is being divided is also with regards to population, from kingdoms, empire, family, clans, like that. And there's this client patronage system that operates in pre-colonial Yoruba society. That means that the more people you have under your control, the more your sense of belonging within the society, starting from the family, and as such, into the larger society. So there are lots of other ways Yoruba people in pre-colonial society saw population, and these have been put into the kind of family planning. As he talked about the reductive aspect of it. They did more of the expanse, but that does not necessarily mean that the reductive didn't exist. And that doesn't necessarily mean that people didn't use the reductive one. It just meant that, hey, it's available right there, just go for it, whichever one you want. And one of the things I'm concerned about here in the contemporary space is that infertility is fast leaving public health discourse. And you hardly go to places where they are discussing infertility as a public health challenge. So we need to start this conversation. As much as it's population, overpopulation, or however we want to construct it, there are undercurrents of infertility we have to look for. And that's the silence story I'm trying to tell.
I also think this discourse is very interesting to me. I also think, even from the religious perspective, Islam also has certain perspectives about population, childbirth, fertility, and stuff like that. That's why if you go to Northern Nigeria for now, you see that the way they understand fertility, that the more children you give birth to, the more wives you have, the more enlarged your resources and everything is, which indirectly one way or the other may try to misrepresent that idea. So yeah, I think it's interesting.
Oh, no.
Sure, yeah, I am interested in how you understand, how you're using neoliberalism, and especially like vis-a-vis standard liberalism and modernity or other kinds of terms. I mean, I can see one element of it is nuclearization. You can think of that maybe in terms of the neoliberal. There are a number of different reasons for asking this question, but one of them, what is your time period again?
52 to 1990.
Okay, so I mean, if we're thinking about the anyway, maybe we'll leave it at that. Like, it seems to me that it was an important part of the theoretical framework and maybe even the abstract, and maybe but I'm wondering how it figures in. That wasn't exactly clear.
Okay, so I did mention about some erroneous, one of engaging is the erroneous neoliberal assumptions with regards to reproductive health.
Yeah,
And
that's why,
like
that's
you
why.
mentioned four of
clear to
them.
me why.
So I mentioned four of them. One of them is that thinking that women are the pivot for population regulation. That's one. I also mentioned that lots of work are done out there. For instance, there's this work called Fatal Misconceptions, which has to do with how it has been written in different books talking about how Africans don't really put rationalism into procreation. And what I'm trying to engage here is that it is not true. It has always been intentional for them. It has always been planned for them. And that they did not reduce does not mean they are not planning. And that they increased it does not mean they are not planning. So however they do it, it is thoughtful. So these are the neoliberal constructs that I'm engaging, not entirely the economic term of neoliberalism. So that's that about that.
Yeah, I guess I'm with Glenn and not fully seeing why neoliberal, like, what about those propositions is neoliberal?
So what?
Those 4 claims that you made,
Okay.
what is neoliberal about them?
Okay, what is neoliberal about?
Yeah, why that word?
Okay, why that one?
It's supposed to like neo-colonial.
Yeah.
So I'm not using neo-colonial in the sense that neo-colonial can be very, very economical when we think about political economy, if you think about it. But with neoliberalism, it's cultural and it is social, not just political and economic. And from the pushbacks that these policy had, the pushbacks are political. The pushback, especially from the which stems from the rejections of the structural adjustment program. And some of them are social, some of them are cultural. So if I'd used neo-colonial, it probably would depict this political economic aspect of this. So I'm using neoliberal because I'm not only looking at the political economic of it, and also I'm looking at the social and cultural. And with the origin of neoliberalism itself, it's quite economic, but with consumerism and a lot of other social cultural aspects of the economy, it has been nuanced to be cultural and also social, very much than neo-colonial has been. Neo-colonial is similar to decolonization, which if we think about it for the most part, has to do with engaging the political, colonial government for political emancipation, economic emancipation, and other subjects. But with neoliberalism, I'm only looking at both of those two. I'm also looking into social and cultural nuances of neocolonialism.
All right. Well, that brings us to 12:30. Thank you to all of our presenters in the panel.